There are approximately 4,682 different videos on the tubes of you about how to bend wood, whether by bent lamination or steam bending or just cutting it out of solid. But what nobody seems to want to talk about is how you determine what curve you need and how to measure that out. So I'm about to utter a sentence that I never wanted to utter in my adult life. Let's do some math.
No! God, please, no! No!
But for woodworkers. What am I doing? I need my mug. My sincerest apologies. Oh. Now, based on the variety of accoutrement on my bench top right now, you can probably surmise that I already began doing said math.
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
In figuring out said curve. But this is kind of a thing that, while it might not make for the most exciting video on the internet, and consequently probably the reason why most people don't make this video, I think it's really important to those of you who are trying to advance your skill set a little bit further to understand how to calculate. And that, I admit right up front, is a generous term because it is rough math at best. But how to calculate the curve that you need and how to go about building the form. So let's begin at the beginning, I suppose. Now, this piece really stems out of a teaching piece that I'm about to go do. This is a class I'm about to teach at Mark Adams in Indiana, and anytime I'm doing a, quote, proper piece of furniture, I create some kind of skeleton to work from, and often that skeleton exists in a CAD program. I use SketchUp because it's what I learned, and it's very simple to use and manipulate. And especially when you're doing curved components, having a drawing becomes absolutely critical because you've got these curved bits that are floating out in space and you need to figure out how to work them into real life. So I'm going to take the measurements that I have in CAD and I'm going to apply them to a full-scale drawing that I can work off of in the meat space, in the real live world, so that I can get accurate parts and critically accurate joinery. Guys, I think it's I think it's time for me to make a new stool. Oh, cranky. You know what? It'll last a couple more videos. Now, as I was saying, none of these tools are necessary. You don't need any of them. Tools cost money, things cost money, and if you don't have money to spend on these things, spend it on wood instead. So I want to address briefly what I mean by math for woodworkers, because this is an arc. It's a section of a circle, and you could run all kinds of equations to figure out the height of the arc and the length of the chord and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the reality is you don't need to do any of those things. I'm not saying don't do it if that's what gets you going in the morning, but people have been making complex furniture with curvature and compound angled tenons for centuries, long before many of them had a proper math education. So this math is kind of basic addition and really just learning how to map it out. And there's my component right there. That is my front apron that I've just drawn. And now, if I want to make life very easy, very simple, I can come in here and draw out my tenons so that I can figure out my angles, but that's a thing we can do later. Right now, what I care about is making the form so that I can actually get this thing in a form, bending, glued up, and then once it's out of clamps, then we can cut our tenons. Now, bending forms come in all shapes and sizes and types and configurations. And I don't want to spend too much time worrying about that in this video because this is more about the figuring out how to do these things than the technical side of like building a form. But in short, you can build a form that has a hollow body that you then skin over the top. like I had planned to do for this one. This is a way to save material, but it does require you to have some thin or bendy material to skin it with. The other way to do it is just to stack a bunch of MDF together and shape each piece, which is probably the way that I will do this form coming up. That being said, let's build a form, shall we? Oh my goodness. You guys ever have one of them days where
Loud noises!
that and you know you got a million things to do and your body just says,
Go yourself, San Diego.
you ever have one of those days? I'm sure you have. I mean, we're all human. Our bodies are fallible. And sometimes you just got to push through the thing. But I am having one of those days today. So I hope you're not. And I hope this coffee helps the situation. But here is the current situation. I've got my form all made. It's all skinned. It's looking good. It's ready to get pressed. Now, as far as how I'm going to actually press this, there are any number of ways to do it. If I were in a different circumstance, I could make a two-part form, meaning that there is a larger part that mirrors this curve that goes on top. I have made that before, and I can link that video in the description or up in the corner, whatever. You know what I'm trying to say. Another option you have is using cauls, meaning getting a bunch of 1/8-inch strips of plywood or MDF that are super flexible that you can stack on top and use as clamping pads to spread out the clamping pressure. I've done that a million times. That is a very valid way to do it. I will also link a video in that because I think we did that when I was in England with my buddy Andy. I think we just used a bunch of cauls, if I recall correctly. See what I did there? But what I'm going to do in this circumstance, because I feel beat to hell today and don't want to make a bunch of calls, I'm just going to use the bag press because I have one. And I'm going to use it because I want to. So that's what's going to happen. But before I do that, I have to resaw a million little bits of ash.
So let's talk briefly about accurate machining and the importance of compounding error. I'm about to make a component that's 7/8 of an inch thick, and it's going to require about 7 laminations, each lamination being 1/8 of an inch thick. And if I'm off by just a 64th over 7 laminations, then that's 7 64ths, either too thick or too thin, neither of which is ideal. And in the process of cutting my laminations on the bandsaw, because my bandsaw is slightly underpowered, and I was too lazy to change out the blade for a fresh one, I ended up with wildly inconsistent laminations due to blade drift. So I had to change course, and I cut my laminations on the table saw, which gave me more accurate laminations, but there was more waste because of a thicker kerf.
So, But these laminations kind of useless. Not useless, they can be used for other things, but they're not going to be used on this one. And we've got a nice consistent pile of laminations to go here. By the way, you might be saying, Eric, why is your face veneer smaller than your core laminations? And that's a totally fair question. It's because this is what I was able to get out of the 2 sheets that I pulled in order to face these components. So while it's not ideal, I'm not going to lose any sleep over it. It'll be just fine. We'll figure out how to deal with that later. Right now, we're going to press these bad boys on this bad boy. Oh yeah. So as we get ready to press this thing, the first thing I want to do is make sure that these laminations are centered. Now I've got my center line here on the front of my form, but I don't have anything on the laminations themselves. So I'm going to draw that center line there. And then the next thing I want to do is make sure that my laminations don't get glued to my form. So in order to avoid that, I am going to face this with packing tape or cellophane tape or whatever you have lying around that does not stick. No, that's not true. Tape is sticky. That won't glue wood to it. That's a way to phrase it. I'm going with it. Just ride with me. You know what I'm trying to say. Don't sass me in the comments. I'm going to put tape on this thing, and then we're going to get this thing in the bag and get a lamination going.
Yeah, switch it up sometimes, you know?
Let's get this thing out of clamps and talk about what happened and what's going on next. So, this is nice and curved. Everything looks good. Everything came out clean. The laminations are all nice and tight. I took it out of the bag after about 3 hours, and then you saw that it had these just brief clamping calls to clamp it down on the form overnight, because while 45 minutes to an hour is plenty of time in the bag for a straight veneer for bent laminations, as they are under pressure, you really want to leave them clamped overnight at a minimum. So I took it out of the bag so this was not under pressure anymore, but keeping this down to make sure that this didn't slowly spring back over the course of the night was critical. Now, that brings up the second thing. You might notice that this doesn't fit my form absolutely perfectly, and that is because of a phenomenon called springback. And there's just, look, it's inescapable. Anytime you curve a component, whether it's steam bent or bent lamination, it's going to want to spring back off the form once you take it out. There's just, it's never going to be exact, to my knowledge at least, never going to be exactly 100%. Some people will compensate for that by making the form ever so slightly steeper, if that's a word for it, than the finished component. And you can do some tests to find out roughly what that needs to be. However, in my opinion, I'm just going to make the form the way I need to make the form, and then knowing that this is going to spring back. Look, once this is off the form, this then becomes my curve. But now what we need to do is actually face this component using our face veneer. Boop.
Now, let's go back to the drawing for a second, because I said earlier that once the component exists, that is the component, and that the drawing doesn't really matter anymore by implication. And that's not true, but that probably wasn't the best way to phrase it. What I'm trying to get at is that the drawing exists as a perfect optimized version of the component. And the component, because I'm a human being making an object and I am not perfect, it probably isn't exactly that. The laminations are probably ever so slightly too thick or too thin. The form itself could be ever so slightly asymmetrical because I made it by hand, and so one side might be slightly flatter than the other. The apex of the curve could be slightly higher than I wanted it to be in the drawing. So once the thing is formed, I always take it back to my drawing and I retrace that curve so that when I'm drawing on my tenons, I'm working with the actual dimensions of the real component and not its kind of idealized version, because those minor discrepancies can come into play later if I'm not aware of them and really frustrate me when I'm trying to figure out why things aren't lining up. And it's probably because my component isn't actually perfect. But once I have the face on and it's out of the bag and it's machined and ready to go, then it's time to start considering how I'm going to make the jig to process this curved component. So I'm going to put it back on my form because my form has my center line and that kind of anchors me in space. Then I can mark the ends of my component as well as my shoulders, and I know that those are now perpendicular to the ground, the bench top, what have you, and I can start to plan how I'm going to make those cuts. You see these kind of harebrained drawings I have going on, but essentially what I'm trying to do is to build a jig to do 3 processes in one. I'm trying to trim the ends so that the component is at 31.5 inches, which is what I had on my drawing. I'm trying to have the thing cut my tenons and establish my shoulders at 30 inches apart on the underside of that curve. And then on the top side of that curve, I need to cut parallel tenon cheeks, also establishing my shoulder at 30 inches. So I could do this in multiple jigs, but again, knowing that this is going to be a class that I'm teaching, the fewer jigs and operations that happen, the more successful the students are going to be. And just from a personal standpoint, you guys know by now that I hate making jigs. It's one of the things I tolerate about being a furniture maker, but I would much rather just cut the damn thing by hand if I'm only doing one of a thing. So this jig is quick and dirty, and it should hopefully work.
Well, after much consternation about how I was actually going to set up this piece to make my cuts for my shoulders and my tenons, this is the jig I came up with. I've got a center line, and I've got these pieces on the outside, which are exactly 30 inches apart, which is exactly the length of my shoulder. So I can line those up just like that, and that lines up with my center line right here. And then I'm going to throw a couple of clamps on here, and I'm just going to chop these at length. So that way my ends are 31.5 because they're going to be 3/4 inch tenons. Great, grand, wonderful, easy enough. Then I'm going to reset this jig so that I cut the underside, including my shoulders, of my tenons. Now, when I flip it over, again, you can see it's going to do this. And so I needed to create some spacers so that it was supported at the proper height. But how do I attach those spacers? With these sliding dovetail clamps so that those remain in place, and I can have one universal jig to cut both the outside and the underside of my apron. So here's the thing. The point of this video was about math for woodworkers, and I stand by that. But sometimes, as the kids say, the math doesn't math. So what happened was, I made the jig so that I could cut this to length, check, went in spades, that's not a phrase. That went aces?
That's a weird phrase.
It went good, so I cut it to length, and then I switched it out for the dado stack, and I cut the first cheek of the tendons, aces. And then when I went to flip it over and do the second cut, the dado stack, and I knew this was a risk, I believe I articulated it on camera, did not reach where I needed it to reach. So I was really in a predicament here. All right, friends, I hope you're buckled in, because, we're about to jump off the deep end. This is a terrible angle. Let me fix that. There's nothing worse than just watching the bottom half of somebody's face talk. That's like a disembodied mouth. Nobody loves that. I need to get better at YouTube. So here's the situation. Talking about we could just cut this by hand, and if it was just me making one of these objects in my shop, that's how I would approach it, because what I'm about to do is going to be overly complicated and entirely unnecessary. However,
Now, while I admit that it is indeed complicated, it's not actually all that hard, if that kind of makes sense. Effectively, what I'm trying to do is to find the angle at which I need to hold the component and the angle at which I need to tilt the blade in order to make the appropriate cut for my shoulder and my tenon. And all I did to find that was to draw a line that connected the end of my tenon to the corner of my shoulder and carry that through my center line. And then I could figure out where the placement of my component needs to go and draw that arc, cut it out on the bandsaw, and that tells me how I'm going to hold my piece. Then I could connect the center line across my jig, and that angle right there is the angle at which I need to tilt my blade in order to cut the correct shoulder and cheek. Now, guys, I don't know how it works out. I'm not smart enough to tell you the math theory behind it. What I'm effectively trying to do, and this is what I mean by math for woodworkers, I'm trying to do math without any real numbers. I don't think I've given you a number this entire video because none of it actually matters. What I'm doing is drawing them out full scale and tracing lines and curves from one thing to the other, from theory to reality. And this is how people made high-end furniture and complicated furniture before they had a math education. They just drew it out and figured out a way to make it work without worrying about angles and chords and arcs, etc., etc. And you can see that it works really well because once I put it back down on my drawing, the theory and the reality do in fact line up.
all right. So again, the value of full-scale drawings, being able to come back and check the actual work to the drawing to make sure that everything is lined up and the angles are correct. Normally, once the piece is made and I'm working to an object, the drawing goes away. But with curved components, angles and compound angles, etc., it's important to have a reference, and I can check that. I'm also using a pair of calipers, which I don't often do when I'm cutting joinery, but I do want to make sure, again, the angle being correct, that it is the same thickness tenon at the top as it is at the bottom, and on one side as it is on the other, and everything is dialing in to just a perfect 3/8. I mean, it's within a thou or two, so that is good enough for government work. Now, the next step is to adjust a couple of things. So you might be saying, Eric, why are you starting with the curved apron? Why not build the rest of the table first? And the reason for that is this is the hardest one to make. So if I need to make any adjustments, I can make it on this one, and then all of the other straight components can adjust accordingly. And as a perfect example, I could have just lied to you and fixed it and not acknowledged that this is happening, but the shoulders on the parts that I just cut are about a 30-second in from the shoulders on the back side. So that is not ideal. That's going to show a gap on the front. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the table saw set back up to the original setting when I cut the underside of these tenons, and I'm just going to move the shoulders in. I could score it with a knife and do it by hand, but I've already got the dado stack in there, so it'll take 3 minutes to set up and make those cuts, even it out. And then essentially, I'm taking the table and making it 1/32 shorter. Nobody's gonna know. Nobody's gonna know. It's gonna be just fine. But that's why I did this component first, so that when I go to cut my second component, it's a lot easier to just make that component 1/32 shorter. So let's do that. And then finally, we can get to fitting some mortises. Well, we went on an adventure today, friends, didn't we? It started off with a simple drawing, and then it turned into bending forms, vacuum bags, processing sleds, joinery sleds that didn't do the job that I needed it to do, so we had to build more joinery sleds, which necessitated more throat plates. Once you start introducing curves into your work, things get complicated very quickly. But it is all just a series of breaking it down into smaller digestible steps to get to a point where we get accurate results. All that being said, turns out woodworking is hard. Who knew? I certainly didn't know. So I'm gonna go home now because I'm tired and hungry, and I hope this was a helpful and interesting video for you. This is probably the most advanced technique video that I've made specifically. Usually they fall more into the camp of design, and then I just happen to do advanced techniques. So I hope it was digestible. If it is, let me know in the comments below. And if it isn't, also let me know in the comments below, because engagement is good for everybody. Just be nice about it. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Be warm and well fed, friends. Cheers.